All right, let's get started on a review for Unit 5. So, Unit 5 is talking about parallelograms. So, a couple things to remember about a parallelogram. The opposite sides are congruent. So, we will know that the side xw will be congruent to yv. So, we know that the question mark is equal to 12.7. So, in a parallelogram, the opposite sides are congruent. All right, now I'm going to skip to number 3. And number 1, we talked about the opposite sides being congruent. And that doesn't help us for this problem because we're not talking about sides, we're talking about the angles. So here I know that the opposite sides are congruent, but that doesn't help us. Another thing that's true about parallelograms are the opposite angles. So angle V here is 62, which will mean that angle X is also 62. So we know that the question mark is 62 degrees. It's not given, but we'll know that angle Y is also congruent to angle W, because in a parallelogram, opposite angles are congruent. So we know opposite sides are congruent. We also know that opposite angles are congruent. All right, so now let's go back to number 2. Opposite sides are congruent. That's true, but it doesn't help us for this one. Opposite angles are congruent. So I know that this angle here is 70 degrees, and its opposite angle is angle C. So I know this is also 70 degrees. So that property doesn't help us. Now, if you look at this angle right here is an acute angle. So that means it's less than 90. This angle here is an obtuse angle, and so that's more than 90. And the reason I point that out is because one of the most common mistakes students make is they'll just say, oh, the question mark's 70. So we know that's not true. An acute angle can't equal an obtuse angle. So now, one of the properties that we learned is that when the angles are consecutive, when they're next to each other, these two angles, whenever they're next to each other in a parallelogram, we know that they are going to add to 180 degrees. So all we do is question mark plus 70 equals 180. You might be able to look at that and get the answer. If not, just solve the equation. Minus 70 from both sides. And we get the question mark is equal to 110 degrees. So this is our third property. So when the angles are next to each other, we call them consecutive. So in a parallelogram, the consecutive angles add to 180 degrees. And we call this supplementary. Two angles that add to 180 degrees. All right, for number 4, it says VT is 20. So from T all the way to V is 20. Find what KT is. So the next property for a parallelogram is that the diagonals bisect each other. So that means that from VT here is a diagonal and UW is a diagonal, and so when they cross, it takes this and cuts it in half. So these two pieces are equal. And then what happens here is this piece gets cut in half, and so these two pieces are equal. So if we know this whole thing is 20, half of 20 would be 10. So this would be 10, and this would be 10, and 10 and 10 makes 20. So we say KT is equal to 10. All right, the last property we're going to look at is we have a parallelogram, and the opposite sides are parallel. So that means that these two lines are parallel. And when we have this diagonal here, what happens is it creates what we call alternate interior angles. So this angle and this angle are equal. And the reason they're called alternate interior angles is because one's on the left side of the line, one's on the right side of the line. They're interior because they're inside the lines. So we call this alternate interior angles. And alternate interior angles are congruent. Now we need this because now we know that the question mark goes here, and now we have a triangle that we can solve, because we know that all three angles of a triangle will always add up to 180. So 60 plus 55 plus the question mark. And if you don't want to write the question mark, you want to write X instead, that's fine. So the three angles of a triangle always add up to 180. And so we get 115 is equal to 180. Now we want to figure out what plus 115 is 180, so we just subtract 115 from both sides. And so our question mark is going to be 65 degrees. So these are 5 properties of parallelograms that you need to know. So whenever you see a parallelogram, you know all these things are true.